Today, we are really privileged to have Cole Oman with us to explain why understanding and practicing strategic foresight is necessary to navigate uncertainty, manage across time horizons, and build agility and resiliency within organizations to ensure long-term success. Cole is a foresight leader in the Office for the Future at Deloitte, a professional services firm, with the stated purpose to make an impact that matters by creating trust and confidence in a more equitable society. As a foresight leader, Cole helps future-proof organizations. He consults on nascent technologies and discontinuous forces and leads teams in the development of robust solutions to address the most significant challenges facing business and society today. Cole also has experience in the Monitor Deloitte strategy practice, which includes scenario planning, competitive response, customer strategy, and artificial intelligence. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Cole Oman. Cole, welcome to our virtual podium.
Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Cole Oman. I help lead strategic foresight at Deloitte. And I'm just really pleased to be with you here today. Really excited for the conversation. As I mentioned, being at Deloitte and in the Office for the Future, our real mandate is to help future-proof Deloitte as an organization. So that primarily happens within 3 programs, which is program 1 of ours is Horizon 3 or Future Ofs. So that's really looking 10 years into the future and partnering with our industry leadership to help them define a vision of what the future of their industry is going to look like, and then what the strategic implications of that are in terms of the way in which that their business needs to shift, and then the way in which they go to market to help assist clients within their industry. The second here is foresight capacity building, or really building robust capabilities of strategic foresight within our organization and helping to scale that across the enterprise. And then the third is a redesign of our business, which is really thinking through, based on what our views of the future is 3 years and 10 years from now, kind of what does that mean in terms of the shifts that we need to make in the next 1 to 3 years in terms of the investments we put down, the capabilities we need to build in the next 5 to 7 years that will really position us well for the future 7 to 10 years from now. So with that introduction, I want to give a little overview of this moment in time of what we're calling the polycrisis. So the polycrisis is a term that you may have been hearing recently. You know, it's been used by the World Economic Forum. It was kind of the term of popularity at Davos a couple months ago. And as you can see here, we really are in a polycrisis. You can see we're coming out of COVID-19 and the aftermath of that pandemic. There's a war in Ukraine that's currently raging. There's this new kind of burgeoning new Cold War potentially between the US and China. There's this existential threat of climate change that may be the most significant challenge of our time. And that's not even including other things like wealth and income inequality, the political polarization that we're seeing at the moment, both in the US and abroad, you know, inflation in the recent banking crisis with Silicon Valley Bank, and generative AI, which may be the most significant stepwise technological change of our time. So there really is this is a profound moment in time where things seem to be just the speed and significance of change is really, really profound at the moment. But it's not just this moment, but we're really in a broader age of discontinuity. And that comes down to really 5 significant forces here that I'm just going to quickly overview and highlight. We're seeing radical shifts in science and technology. You know, over the last 60 years, we've ridden the wave of Moore's law that has really used computing and software to really change the world around us in the digital space. We've seen new technologies, as I mentioned, through generative AI, that now we're on the precipice of potentially a second scientific revolution that is really going to transform the world around us and is really breaking the bonds of correlation and causation of science in the past that are going to allow us to make just these significant innovations that will change the world around us. You're seeing globalization being reinvented and the return of active governments. You know, since the 1980s, from the views of Milton Friedman through F.A. Hayek and the Chicago School, you really saw the expansion of neoliberalism and globalization. And in the US, that was known as something as the Washington Consensus, which was something that we all recognize as, low taxes, global free trade, low regulation, really things that kind of opened up through Ronald Reagan here in the US, and that has really carried us up until the financial crisis of '08. But we're now seeing that prototype really no longer works, and that's really causing some of the significant changes that we're seeing in governments, both here in the US as well as abroad, and alluding to some of the things that we're seeing that I mentioned earlier between this new Cold War between the US and China. But it's also the rise of networked power is causing some of this instability. As I was talking about with radical science and technology and what's happened over the last 60 years, one of the main things that's happened is the world is just way more connected than it's ever been before. We all have, these smartphones in our pocket that allow us to communicate at the click of a button, and it allows us to have instantaneous communication, which is really allowing for new network power to emerge. You've seen just in the last 3 to 5 years, things like Black Lives Matter or Me Too, or these kind of emergent network social changes. And that's really putting stress on the system of old power structures. And so we're seeing this balance of top-down hierarchical power with bottom-up command and control. And that's really leading to this second to last shift here about the need for stakeholder capitalism and the real internalization of externalities. And so there's more demand of business and what's being expected of businesses, but also of politicians, of social organizations and institutions. And finally, all of this is leading towards the decline of really the firm or an organization operating individually in a vacuum, and the rise of the ecosystem as the new unit of analysis. It's no longer these go-it-alone individual organizations, but one must really think about how they're connected to the broader system of all these interconnected ecosystems. So with that table setting, I think it's, potentially easy to see why do we need to practice foresight? Well, there's a lot that's really changing. I think there's 3 real kind of objectives of foresight, which is 1, to provide illumination or to elucidate and bring clarity. The second is to really navigate through this moment in time and to better understand where we're going. But the third one here I think is really important and is something that needs to be more emphasized within strategic foresight and is growing more and more, and that is activation, which is that we're not really passive recipients of the future, but we have agency and we can actively shape the future that we want. So really, the benefits of strategic foresight, it's not about, we're not soothsayers. No one here knows what the future holds. And we don't say that we can predict the future. No one really can predict the future. No one has a crystal ball, as you can see on the left. But it's really about embedding, the ability to think in new ways, bring about agility and flexibility and resiliency. It's about really having adaptability and being able to test new strategies and think in new ways. And finally, having the confidence to move and actually activate based on all the preparation that's been done. I love this quote by Charlie Munger. He is, the best friend and, the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway with Warren Buffett. And he said, personally, I've gotten to where now I really use a 2-track analysis, which is first, what are the factors that govern the interests involved? And second, what are the subconscious influences where the brain is automatically doing things? And what I like to, shorthand this to is basically saying, really, what are the forces in play and what are the things that leads our mind astray? And those are the real 2 fundamental things that drive proper foresight thinking and having successful outcomes. So I'm actually going to dive into the second one first, which is around the subconscious influences in play. So here's a quick visual. And on the left, you see a map of California from the 16th century, and then one now on the right of California that we now know from today. And I think this is really great because there's this concept of mental models, which is, having these different toolkits to apply to problems in order to think in a better way. And what I love about this is really map and territory is a mental model, but I would view it almost as the meta mental model of all models, which is to say that there is a reality out there that has infinite depth and complexity and richness to it. And what we're trying to do is really find a way to provide the right map to navigate through that super complex reality. And so on the left, you can see that what are sometimes not having the right map can lead you astray, and having an appropriate map can help lead you properly into the future. So why do we not have a proper map when we're thinking to do strategic foresight? Well, really, this is at the heart of evolution. And these three pieces I've taken from a man named Michael Levin, who is a developmental biologist as well as a synthetic biologist. And he said something that I think is so true here, which is really, there are three things that govern any biological organism. And that's active inference, minimized surprise, and metabolic constraints. So active inference is, based on what I see, what can I infer about what's going to happen? Minimize surprise. If I'm living in a world of danger and scarcity and privation, how can I make sure that nothing happens that's going to put me at risk? And metabolic constraints, which is I have a limited amount of energy and I can only do certain things at certain moments, right? Well, that leads to three cognitive biases that really constrain us in myopic thinking. I call that the dark triad of myopic thinking. So the first is availability bias, which is active inference is only on the available information that we have. The second, minimize surprise, then goes to really confirming what we've already seen. So I want to reconfirm what I already think is the case, so I minimize the surprise that's out there. And the third is metabolic constraints, which is I'm constrained in what I can do. And so therefore, I'm going to maintain the status quo generally. And that has worked really well for us as evolutionary creatures in the past, because we lived in a world of danger and scarcity and privation, where if you didn't use these tools, you would potentially die. However, we now have evolved out of that world of danger and scarcity and privation. And so we're looking for new tools because what has gotten us here will not get us there. So how do we combat that? Well, we move to using strategic foresight. And the principles of foresight, there's really three, and I call this the holy trinity of futures thinking, which is first, how do we combat availability bias? Well, we think outside in instead of inside out. Instead of thinking of just what I can see and my individual limited experiences, we seek an outside in view of all the major forces in play and what's happening. The second is how do we combat confirmation bias? Well, we're scenaric based. Instead of reconfirming what we already see, we look to think in different scenaric ways of what's outside what would be confirmed of what we already see. So think in scenarios versus single outcomes. And the third here is how do we combat status quo bias? We think future back instead of today forward. So instead of taking the status quo and moving incrementally forward in a small limited way, we actually move to the future and then think backwards from that into backcasting. And when those three things come together, that's how you start to move towards a beauty of foresight. So once we bring those new mindsets and muscles into play, one of the most effective things towards success is really defining the problem, and that's effective framing. So I love this quote by Albert Einstein, which is, it may be apocryphal, but it's something to the words of the effect of, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 50 minutes defining the problem. And I think there's so much wisdom in that statement. And if you look here, we really like to think about problems in three ways. There are type 1 problems, which we call technical problems. The problem is clear, the solution is clear. It's just about putting best practices together. The second is conceptual problems, which is the problem is clear, but the solution is unclear. And so we put a process or an approach together in order to attack that. The third is type 3 problems, which is unclear problems and unclear solutions. And that's really what strategic foresight is at its core. And so that is a wicked problem. And futures thinking is a type 3 problem. And so it's very important to realize that and realize what it takes in type 3 problem thinking of futures thinking, which is significantly different than type 1 and type 2 problem thinking. So moving forward with that, apologies, I think I've moved. How do you structure a process to do that? What does a type 3 problem look like when doing strategic foresight? Well, once you frame the problem appropriately, then it's about exploring the search space. And to me, I also like this concept that I think comes from Donald Rumsfeld about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And he said, it's not the known knowns or the known unknowns that really put you at risk, but it's the things that you don't even know that you don't know, right? So going through that, how do we think about that when doing strategic foresight and futures thinking? Well, we first go to our known knowns and we say, okay, what do we know about this problem? And we collect all the data that we already have related to that, and we codify that so it's there and clear and clean. The second is we have a set of known unknowns that we need to learn more about. And that's how you go through research, you do expert interviews, you observe things that you're seeing, and then you clearly define those things and structure them. But it's really the unknown unknowns where the magic of strategic foresight happens. And that is expanding into those blind spot spaces of things that you're not even aware of. And what you do for that is you do scanning, you do sensing, you frame these unknown unknowns up so that you can learn more about them. You go on learning journeys. But really what I'm going to talk about more, and one of the main tools that's used for strategic foresight, is building scenarios. And that goes back to those 3 principles I told you about, which is thinking instead of in a singular way, in a scenario way. So let's think about building scenarios. What does that look like? Well, first, you need to determine the forces. So we've talked about how your mind can lead you astray. Now you need to understand what are the forces at play or the critical drivers of the future. So we like to bucket this in mainly 3 ways. The first here is thinking about the external environment. And there's a great acronym that's broadly used within strategic foresight, which is that of STEEP. Social changes, technological changes, economic changes, environmental changes, and political changes. And so understanding really what are those 5 major categories and what's happening in the external environment that's framing the current situation. The second is thinking at your marketplace level. And that may have a business connotation to it, but mainly what it is what's the domain or field that you're operating in? That's the second area that you need to understand. So what are the dynamics at the industry level of that specific domain? What are the unmet needs of your customers or whoever your clients are in that area? What are your competitors doing comparatively to what you're doing? And who are the stakeholders in your specific domain? And what is the user journey of the individual consumer or customer or client? And what are the steps that they go through? That's the marketplace. Then the third is understanding your organization. What are your business models of that of you and your competitors? What is the product and services that you're currently offering? Your operations capabilities? What are the technologies that are feeding into that in management systems? And having a proper understanding of these 3 things helps you frame the critical drivers that are in play. Now, once you've done that, the magic comes in building potential futures. There's 4 classic ways that you can go about this. The first is a deductive approach, which relies on taking those forces and building them into uncertainties. Here would be an example of a critical uncertainty. Urbanization over the next 10 years, right? There's one side of that, which is urbanization continues due to the benefits of having a symbiotic environment and a knowledge economy that brings together thinkers and the arts and universities and funding mechanisms similar to Silicon Valley. The other side of that uncertainty might be something like actually urbanization will recede due to new technologies and the ability for remote and hybrid work. Then what one can do is taking all the uncertainties, put them on 2x2s and build scenarios in each of those 4 quadrants. That would be the deductive approach. The second is a more deliberate or explicit approach, which is what is the consensus future that we think people generally believe to be true? We might call that the expected future. And then what we would do is say, well, what would an optimistic future be? One that we would want to shape or bring about to come to be. And a second would be, what's a challenging future, or one that we're unprepared for that we might need to be better prepared for into the future, right? And then we would start to build out what those futures look like. A third way is an inductive approach, which is building bottom-up stories from those drivers that you have and bringing them together to create a narrative or potential different scenarios. And a fourth here would be something which we call like the quick and go method, which is take 4 different uncertainties, throw them together, and start to build out what a story of those futures are. I've used all 4 of these scenarios. They all have their benefits and their drawbacks in certain ways and certain trade-offs. However, they're all very, very valuable in creating stories and scenarios about the future. And bringing together these different scenarios, we're able to crowdsource ideas about what the future holds. And one just, further thought around that, I would say, is we use these to really, in a Jungian way, crowdsource the collective unconscious of all different experts and people thinking about what the future holds across a variety of different domains and expertises. And then from that, we're able to explore the bounds of our unknown unknowns and realize what is potentially possible in these different futures. Now, why is it critically important to build scenarios and stories? Well, here's an example I would give you. What can you learn from this chart here that I'm presenting to you? Now, it looks like you have some names of different people here, Papa and Mama and Goldilocks, and the species of what they are and different ages, and what's the different appetite level and how big are they and what do they like in certain porridge, right? You can see a variety of different data, and data is very important, but it's the thing now and about how important data is, right? But what do you learn from this data? Now, when I show you this, what do you learn from this? You immediately recognize the old story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, right? Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Goldilocks, and she went for a walk in the forest, and the porridge was too hot. And this really shows you the importance of stories, that individuals learn through stories. They conceptualize information through stories. They're able to really move forward and learn and grow and prepare through stories. And that's what scenarios provide. So once you've crowdsourced a set of scenarios and you have a variety of different stories and scenarios, then what's the next step from that? Well, it's crafting a narrative, which is bringing clarity and agency to the future. So as I mentioned before at the beginning of this talk, one of the important things and benefits of strategic foresight is bringing clarity to the current moment. It's about illuminating and elucidating the current situation. But it's also about navigation and activation. And that's where agency comes in, which is it empowers us to confidently make decisions and move beyond being just passive recipients of the future, but actively shaping and creating a future that we want. So what we can do is taking that narrative of all these different stories from scenarios together. This is the general scaffolding and structure of how we would build a narrative, which is think about this moment in time, what is currently happening? What is the burning platform of why things need to change? How can we look back in the past at what's happened to understand how we've gotten to today? Based on that of the past in the current moment, what is the essence or evergreen nature of what is happening? So for example, an automobile in the past, right? We might be thinking about the future of consumer and thinking about automobiles. But what I would argue is the essence or evergreen nature of what a automobile company is bringing is mobility. It's not about the car itself. The innate job to be done or essence or evergreen role is to bring someone from point A to point B. And so understanding that no matter whether you're in the past and it's a horse, whether it's an automobile, whether it's an airplane, or whether it's some rocket ship in the future, the evergreen nature here, the unmet need of the individual is finding a job to be done of moving from point A to point B. Then using that, what is the critical drivers of the future? as in what are these drivers, as I mentioned earlier, that are going to be the determinants of where the future goes. Based on all of these futures that we've created, we can then interrogate into them and say, what is similar across all of these futures? What is everyone saying? What is different across these futures? What are the themes that we're seeing thread between all of these futures? And that allows us to then identify what is prudent to assume about the future. If everyone across all scenarios is saying something, it's pretty prudent to assume that this is going to be a driver of the future. What is uncertain about the future? What is different across these different futures that we're seeing? And then finally, what we do is use all of this to create a vision of where do we want the future to go? What would we agenically shape about what the future is going to bring? And based on all of that, of the prudent assumptions about the future, the critical uncertainties, and the vision of where we want the future to go, what does that then mean the strategic implications of that are? What are the unmet needs of individuals and consumers in that world? Who are the winners and losers in that type of world? And then finally, what are the opportunities, the risks, and strategic positioning of our individual organization and what we need to do in order to be prepared for these different futures and the vision that we're trying to create? So what that really comes down to is how can we manage across time horizons to then start to put down the investments today to build into the capabilities of tomorrow in the next 3 to 5 years, to then be prepared to have a strategic set of bets laid down to then in the future, 7 to 10 years from now, be well positioned to deliver on the business models and the services and the mission and vision of what we want 7 to 10 years from now in the future. So this is extremely important and something that I think is a glaring hole within strategic foresight, broadly within the practice and what I see in a lot of different places, as well as what a lot of different experts in strategic foresight. And that's not a judgment, that is just to say, I do not support necessarily the philosophy of this person, but I think Karl Marx has a great line where he said in the past, philosophers of the world have only tried to describe the world, but it's important, like the real question is, how can we change it? It's not about just philosophers interpreting the world, but it's about changing the world. And here is, we can learn so much about strategic foresight. We can do all of the mental exercises of understanding what's happening in the world. But the point is how do we move from foresight to insight to understand the strategic implications of that? And here I love this great 3x3, which is strategy happens at the intersection of scenarios, which is what is the future business environment, what's happening, vision, what's our strategic intent of what we want to be, and then capabilities, who are we and how are we going to win? And that is really the strategic implication, moving from foresight to insight, about what does it then mean based on what we've seen. It isn't just a intellectual exercise of foresight, it's about actually making changes. So then, based from foresight to insight, how do we move from insight to action? So moving from the so what to the now what? What do we actually do? And here's a variety of different tools that we use in strategy, but that's, let's set a vision and a mission and a purpose. Let's then think about across the ambition matrix, what are the transformational bets we need to lay down? What are the adjacent bets we need to lay down? And how do we double down into our core business? How do we innovate across the 10 types of innovation? And how do we make sure that then we define that in a strategy through the strategic choice cascade that shows us, what is our winning aspiration? Where do we want to play? How do we want to win? What capabilities do we need to build? And what management systems do we need to put in place to reinforce that? So again, doing foresight, strategic foresight at the earliest top of the funnel is great and informative, but it's about how are we then going to use that to execute? How are we going to move from foresight to insight and insight to action? And that brings about then this fourth key principle that I've alluded to, which is, I talked about moving from inside out to outside in, moving from today forward to future back, moving from single outcome to scenaric. This brings us to the fourth principle, which is how can we think across time horizons? How can we manage horizon 3 to anticipate, to inform horizon 2, to then inform horizon 1? And if we're thinking outside in, future back, scenaric, and across time horizons, and we're moving from foresight to insight and insight to action, that is really where everything comes together into a beautiful formulation of strategic foresight. finally, putting it all together. What would something like this look like? Well, it would be some form of having a perceiving mechanism that's looking at trends management, the critical drivers, as I mentioned, then moving to identifying opportunities in some form of across the different transformation, ambition matrix. You then would build out scenarios and build out what potential business models would look like, then accelerate some of these into incubation, and then really map those and implement and execute. So what's an example of something like this? So at our firm, in my group in Strategic Foresight, we led some work related to the future of TMT, what we now have called the 5 worlds. So we looked at what does the world of technology look like 5 years from now? And we came to this, going through the process that I just illustrated, came to this of the 5 worlds. And I'll give I know we're coming up on time here, but I'll give a quick overview of this, which is inner world, which is technology wants to come inside the human being and augment and live symbiotically with the individual. I'm sure a ton of people are wearing Apple Watches right now, or Whoops, or Oura rings, but this is going to change even more so in the future into things like CRISPR-Cas9 and synthetic biology and other ways in which that technology is going to conform to the individual. Mirror world, very similar to the metaverse, which is technology wants to create a digital replica of the physical world as well as new worlds. And as much as, the metaverse and Mark Zuckerberg has been talking about that, I think one thing that he has gotten right here is this sense of presence and embodiment, which is, right now as I'm speaking to you, I'm on a 2D screen, I'm very, you don't feel like we're together. Well, that's what the promise of the metaverse really has. Off-world, which is technology wants to move beyond our planet. Think about Starlink and what's happening right now with SpaceX and what Elon Musk has been able to do with that company and providing, internet to Ukraine during the war. We're going to see even more of that, but the proliferation is going to move to, the ability to build mega structures that are built out into space and colonization. So off-world will be the next frontier. War world, technology has always augmented conflict and how we operate with conflict, whether it's a club, a spear, a rifle, a rocket, a plane. We've always used technology to augment combat. But this is going to move to new forms of misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing, new forms of psych ops. We're already seeing certain things of synthetic media. And so this is really going to change the way in which warfare is even done. And then finally, habitable world, which is technology wants to heal our planet. And there's a proliferation of new technologies that are clean energy and other ways that we're looking, carbon sequestration, to really heal our planet. So these are the 5 worlds that we came up with through going through the strategic foresight process. But then we move from that to action, which is the next slide that I'm going to show you here, which is converting that into partnerships with clients to start to build out this vision for better of these different 5 worlds.
We are at a pivotal inflection point. Many foundational beliefs and behaviors that have prevailed for more than 30 years are unraveling rapidly, and technology is at the heart of that change. Welcome to the Worlds of 2030, an immersive experience designed to explore and co-create potential futures. While society has historically determined the impact of technology, now technology is so powerful that it's altering society, whether we intend it or not. These potent technology trends are driving the emergence of the 5 future worlds highlighted in this experience, each worth trillions of dollars and each holding the potential for both promise and peril. These worlds are closer than we think. The question for every leader now is, are we comfortable letting the future be determined by default, or do we want to determine the future by design? Come experience the worlds of 2030 in the Deloitte greenhouse.
Great. So moving to the final slide here, and I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A here, and I know I'm about 5 minutes over. The last thing that I want to say is just to offer my sincere gratitude and appreciation to be able to speak to this group. I want to say thank you. And, I want to recognize the difficulty of this current situation. It may feel like we're on a dire trajectory currently with all the things that I highlighted in the polycrisis and the time of discontinuity. And I also understand, the tyranny of the now that really adds to this, which makes it difficult sometimes to think about the future. And I know I don't need to say this as a group who many are steeped in strategic foresight, but there is a cost to not thinking about the future. And sometimes that cost can be existential, both for an organization as well as for society more broadly, and what we're entering into in this, era of climate change and generative AI and what that offers, even in, and some risk with that. And so I think there's a cost not thinking about the future. And so remembering the importance of strategic foresight and remembering that, as I've said, we don't need to be passive recipients of the future, but we can actively shape and create the future that we want. And we have agency in order to do that. And so with that, I just want to thank you for your time.